The late afternoon sun cast a warm golden hue over Washington, D.C., as Karoline Leavitt sat in her apartment, sipping her coffee and reviewing her notes for the day. At just 27 years old, she had already made history as the youngest White House press secretary, a role that demanded both intelligence and resilience. Her apartment, located just a short distance from the White House, reflected her disciplined nature. Neatly stacked documents on her desk, a meticulously organized wardrobe, and a well-maintained schedule. She was always prepared, always focused. Today was supposed to be just another routine day, another set of briefings and press statements. But fate had other plans. She stood in front of her mirror, adjusting the navy blue blazer that had become her signature. The small silver cross pinned on her collar caught the sunlight, gleaming for a brief moment. It wasn't just an accessory. It was a quiet but powerful symbol of her faith, a reminder of where she came from and what she stood for. Being raised in New Hampshire, faith had always been an integral part of her life, guiding her through the storm of politics. She never saw it as something controversial, until today. Just as she reached for her phone to check the latest headlines, it buzzed sharply in her hand. The screen lit up with a name she never ignored, President Trump. Straightening her posture instinctively, she answered. His voice, firm and direct, filled the room. Karoline, there's a case happening at the D.C. local court. A group of Christians is suing because they were banned from praying in public. I need you to go there, observe, take notes, report everything back to me. She didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. When the president called, she listened. Understood, sir. I'm on it, she replied, already grabbing her bag and slipping on her heels. The urgency in his voice told her this wasn't just any case. It was something bigger, something that could have lasting implications. As she stepped out of her apartment and into the sleek black SUV waiting for her, she felt the weight of the task ahead. She had handled press crises before, spoken at the White House podium, and navigated political storms, but this was different. This wasn't just about politics. This was personal, and something told her that by the end of the day, her faith and her legal mind would be tested like never before. The drive to the courthouse was quick, but the weight of the assignment settled on Karoline's shoulders. As the SUV weaved through the crowded streets of Washington, she stared out the window, lost in thought. She knew this case wasn't just another routine hearing. It was about something deeper, something that could set a precedent. The moment the car pulled up to the courthouse, she stepped out with confidence, her heels clicking against the pavement. Taking a deep breath, she adjusted her blazer, making sure her cross sat neatly on her collar. Then, without hesitation, she walked through the heavy glass doors and into the heart of the courtroom. The room was a mess of voices and movement, filled with people waiting for their turn before the judge. Some were here for minor disputes, traffic violations, contract disagreements, late rent payments. Others simply sat in the back, watching. The air was thick with tension and impatience, the sound of murmuring voices mixing with the sharp clatter of keyboards from the court clerks. Karoline took it all in, her sharp eyes scanning the space as she moved toward a seat in the middle row. As she settled in, she couldn't help but notice the people around her. Just a few seats away sat a man wearing a bright red t-shirt with bold white letters that read "I am king." He lounged back casually, scrolling through his phone, completely unbothered. To her right, a woman wore an oversized, flashy necklace that caught the fluorescent lights every time she moved. It was impossible to ignore, yet no one seemed to care. Karoline frowned slightly. It was clear the courtroom had no strict dress code, which made her wonder why she felt the weight of so many eyes lingering on her small silver cross. Before she could dwell on it, the heavy wooden door behind the judge's bench swung open. A hush fell over the room as Judge Charles Hargrove entered, his black robe crisp and pressed, his salt and pepper hair combed back with precision. He carried himself with an air of absolute authority, his wire-rimmed glasses perched low on his nose as he scanned the room. He wasted no time, his gavel slamming against the desk with a sharp crack. "This is a court of law, not a place for personal displays," he announced, his deep voice cutting through the silence. Karoline sat up straighter, sensing something was off. The way his eyes roamed the room, pausing briefly on her, sent a quiet but clear message. This judge wasn't just strict, he had an agenda, and she had a feeling she was about to become a part of it. Judge Hargrove's gaze moved swiftly over the crowd, his expression unreadable, until his eyes landed on Karoline. For a brief moment, his face stiffened, his fingers tapping against the desk as if he were debating something. Then, just as he was about to call the next case, he hesitated. The silence in the room stretched, uneasy and unnatural. Slowly, he leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as his sharp eyes zeroed in on her. "You," he said, his voice cool but firm. "Step forward." Karoline didn't flinch. She had spent enough time in politics to recognize when someone was trying to make an example out of her. Still, she hadn't done anything wrong. Keeping her expression neutral, she rose from her seat and walked toward the bench, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She could feel the weight of the room shifting, quiet murmurs spreading through the crowd as people turned to watch. As she reached the front, Judge Hargrove folded his hands on the desk, eyeing her like a schoolteacher about to scold a student. "That cross," he said, his voice carrying a controlled edge. "It doesn't belong here." Karoline blinked, confused for a split second. She instinctively reached up, touching the small silver cross on her blazer's collar. It had been there all day, just like every other day. "Excuse me, Your Honor?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "This is a courtroom," he continued, his tone growing sharper. "A neutral space. Personal symbols, especially religious ones, have no place here. Remove it." A thick, heavy silence settled over the room. Karoline could feel the shift in energy, the way people straightened in their seats, how some exchanged glances, waiting to see what would happen next. She took a slow breath, steadying herself before she spoke. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said, her voice even, "this cross is a personal item. It does not disrupt the proceedings in any way, nor does it violate any court rules. The First Amendment protects my right to wear it." Judge Hargrove's jaw tightened. His fingers drummed against the wood, then suddenly stopped. "I decide what is and isn't appropriate in my courtroom," he said, his voice cutting. "And I'm telling you now, either remove it, or I will hold you in contempt." A few gasps rippled through the courtroom. Karoline didn't move. She had faced tough press rooms, political opponents, and the harshest of critics, but this was different. This wasn't about an argument over policy or media spin. This was a direct challenge to her right to her own faith. She met the judge's glare, standing tall. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she repeated, her voice unwavering. "You cannot single me out while allowing others to wear their personal symbols." She glanced around, motioning subtly toward the man in the bold-lettered t-shirt, the woman with the oversized necklace. "If my cross is inappropriate, why are theirs acceptable?" Judge Hargrove's face darkened, his grip tightening around his gavel. "I don't need a lecture on the law," he snapped. "You've already wasted enough of this court's time." Without another word, he lifted the gavel and struck it down with force. "You are fined $500 for contempt of court." The room fell into stunned silence. Karoline didn't react immediately, though she felt a slow, steady burn in her chest. She knew exactly what this was. This wasn't about order. It wasn't about neutrality. This was about control, about power, and about someone using their authority to send a message. She could have backed down. She could have simply nodded, paid the fine, and walked away. But that wasn't who she was. Instead, she stood a little taller, let her gaze settle firmly on the judge, and gave the smallest, most knowing smile. Because this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Karoline didn't move as the gavel's echo faded. The weight of the fine pressed down, but she refused to let it shake her. Instead, she reached into her bag, pulled out a small card, and held it up for the room to see. The golden letters gleamed under the fluorescent lights. White House Press Secretary, Karoline Leavitt. The shift in the room was instant. The murmurs started again, whispers spreading like wildfire. Judge Hargrove's expression flickered, a brief flash of recognition crossing his face. He knew exactly who she was. "Your Honor," Karoline said, her voice steady but edged with quiet authority. "I respect this court and its procedures, but I also know my rights. And what just happened here?" She tilted her head slightly. "It's not just unfair, it's unconstitutional." Judge Hargrove scoffed, but she saw the way his fingers twitched against the desk. "You think your position gives you special privileges?" he said, but there was an unease creeping into his voice. "Not at all," Karoline replied smoothly. "But it does mean I understand the law, and right now, you're violating it." She took a step closer, placing her credentials down on the bench with quiet confidence. "Let me remind you of a case. Church of Lukumi Babalu I versus City of Hialeah. The Supreme Court ruled that targeting religious expression without just cause is a violation of the First Amendment. By singling me out, while allowing others to wear their personal symbols without question, you are engaging in the same kind of discrimination. A ripple of murmurs spread across the courtroom. People shifted in their seats. A few turned to look at the man in the I Am King t-shirt, the woman with the oversized necklace. The realization was sinking in. Judge Hargrove had ignored them completely, but when it came to Karoline's small silver cross, he suddenly found a problem. The judge's face reddened slightly, his grip tightening around the gavel. "That's not," he started, but Karoline didn't let him finish. "You didn't object to their attire," she continued, her voice calm but unrelenting. "You didn't find them. You didn't even acknowledge them. You targeted me. And not because I disrupted anything, but because of what I believe." In the back of the room, someone discreetly lifted their phone, angling it just right. A recording had started. The moment was no longer just inside the courtroom. It was slipping beyond these walls. And Karoline knew it. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something much bigger. Judge Hargrove opened his mouth, then closed it again, his face darkening as he realized the shift happening in the room. The power he had wielded so effortlessly just moments ago was slipping through his fingers. He cleared his throat, gripping his gavel as if it could somehow bring back control. "This court," he started, his voice losing its sharp edge, "this court operates under strict guidelines. My decision stands." But there was hesitation now, a crack in his confidence that hadn't been there before. Karoline didn't back down. She met his gaze, unshaken, her posture unyielding. "Your Honor, I hope you understand the seriousness of what just happened here," she said, her voice unwavering. "Because the White House does." The air in the courtroom seemed to freeze. A ripple of whispers passed through the crowd. The court clerk, Mrs. Thompson, glanced toward the bailiff, James Wilson, who had been standing near the judge's bench the entire time. They exchanged a look, subtle but telling. This wasn't the first time they had seen Hargrove target someone unfairly. But this time, he had picked the wrong person. Karoline continued, her voice clear and firm. "The moment you find me for wearing this cross, I send a message to my colleagues at the White House. An official complaint is being documented as we speak. And given the public nature of this courtroom," she glanced toward the onlookers, several of whom were now subtly recording the exchange, "I imagine this will be discussed far beyond these walls." Judge Hargrove's face went pale. He shifted in his seat, his hand tightening around the gavel as if he could somehow reverse the damage. He looked at the court clerk, then at Wilson, as if silently demanding support. But neither of them spoke. They just watched, waiting. He let out a slow breath, then forced a tight smile. "There's no need for this to escalate," he said quickly, waving a dismissive hand. "In light of new considerations, I will withdraw the fine." But the courtroom didn't relax. No one was fooled. Karoline tilted her head slightly, studying him. "With all due respect, Your Honor, withdrawing it now doesn't change what you did. It only proves you knew it was wrong." Hargrove's jaw tightened, his face blotchy with frustration, but he said nothing. The damage was done. He had lost. And from the way the crowd murmured and the clerk's hands trembled slightly over her keyboard, it was clear. This wasn't going away anytime soon. For a moment, the courtroom was completely silent. Then, like a dam breaking, the whispers turned into full-blown chatter. People exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others muttering about what they had just witnessed. The court clerk's fingers trembled as she typed, capturing every word for the official record. The bailiff, James Wilson, stood motionless, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something that said he knew this was bigger than just another case. Then, someone in the back snapped a photo. A reporter, who had been quietly observing, rushed out the door, already typing out a breaking news alert. Within minutes, the story was out. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt fined in court for wearing a cross, but exposes the judge's bias instead. The news spread like wildfire. By the time Karoline stepped out of the courthouse and into the late afternoon sun, her phone was vibrating nonstop. She glanced down. Notifications flooded her screen. #Cross in Court was already trending. Videos from inside the courtroom had surfaced, snippets of her confrontation with Judge Hargrove being shared thousands of times. Comment after comment poured in. She stood her ground. This is what real leadership looks like. Religious freedom isn't optional. Conservative figures, legal analysts, and everyday Americans weighed in, calling for action. The judge's name was everywhere, his history now under scrutiny. Hours later, the official statement came. Judge Charles Hargrove had been placed under investigation, pending suspension. Reports surfaced of similar cases, instances where he had unfairly penalized people for religious symbols while ignoring others. The Judicial Council announced a full review, and suddenly, this wasn't just about Karoline anymore. It was about a system that had quietly been enforcing double standards for years. That evening, standing before a sea of reporters outside the White House, Karoline addressed the nation. Cameras flashed as she stepped up to the podium, the silver cross still gleaming on her blazer. "This is not about me," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "This is about the right of every American to express their faith without fear of discrimination." Today was just one courtroom, one judge. But how many others have faced the same injustice without a voice? That ends now. The crowd erupted in applause, and the movement had officially begun. Judge Hargrove sat alone in his dimly lit office, his career crumbling around him. His phone, once a tool of authority, now buzzed with messages he didn't want to read. Calls from the Judicial Council, reporters demanding statements, former colleagues distancing themselves. He had spent decades on the bench, believing he was upholding order, yet in a single afternoon, his actions had been exposed for what they truly were, bias disguised as law. He sighed, rubbing his temples as he replayed the courtroom moment in his mind. He had underestimated Karoline Leavitt. She wasn't just another defendant. She was someone who knew the law better than he did, and worse, she had the entire country watching. Days later, the Judicial Council announced new policies aimed at ensuring fairness in courtrooms nationwide. No judge would have the authority to arbitrarily ban religious symbols without clear legal grounds. Mandatory First Amendment training was introduced for all court officials, ensuring that personal beliefs would never again influence judicial decisions. The case had sparked a national conversation, forcing courts across the country to reevaluate their own practices. Back at the White House, Karoline stood in her office, gazing at a framed piece of paper on the wall, the $500 fine Judge Hargrove had handed her. She had never paid it, not because she refused, but because it had been wiped clean the moment the judge withdrew it. Still, she kept it, not as a reminder of the fight she had won, but as a symbol of what one voice, standing firm, could accomplish. Smiling slightly, she adjusted the silver cross on her blazer. This wasn't just her victory. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been told to hide their faith. And it was only the beginning.